Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 11th of January of 2025. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Moscow. We have lots of very interesting details. The Kremlin plans to discuss new security agreements with Trump that would involve rolling back NATO on its eastern borders. That was reported by the Financial Times, citing Russian sources. According to a former senior Kremlin official and another person who discussed the issue with the Russian president, Putin's main goal in any talks is new security agreements that ensure Ukraine never joins NATO and that US-led military alliance abandons some eastern deployments. That was stated by the article. Putin wants to change the rules in the international order so that there are no threats to Russia. He is very concerned about what the world will look like after the war, the former Kremlin official said. So I'll remind you that during the previous century and in this century there were a lot of agreements between Russia and NATO, and the main purpose and the main talks in those contracts, those agreements were not to not to take more countries inside of this alliance by NATO, not to move further in the eastern direction. But after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, several countries from the Eastern Europe joined this alliance. Basically, that NATO broke the contract between Russia and this organization. And now Putin wants to force NATO to fall back from some territories, and most likely Putin is talking about the Baltic states, maybe Poland, maybe Slovakia, maybe Romania. Obviously, NATO is not going to do this ever, but the most important thing is that Trump, according to different experts, is going to leave NATO itself. The USA will leave NATO organization, and maybe in this case the Russians will be able to force NATO to follow the contracts that were signed with the Soviet Union. Anyway, the next 20 or 10 or 20 years are going to be very interesting. And the most important is that Ukraine will never join NATO. This is the most important, let's say, requirement, demand from the Russian side. Now let's discuss the situation in Ukraine. As for Zelensky himself, as I understand, if the United States of America is going to leave the NATO organization, then most likely Ukraine will take place of the state, because according to Zelensky, the defense coalition we have created will help to reject all US claims to the territories of countries such as Canada and Denmark. Obviously, this is something amazing. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation on the ground. And first we're going to talk about the Sumy direction. The Ukrainians continue making different statements and analysis about the situation on the ground. And the Ukrainians are saying that basically the Ukraine army can't retreat from the Kursk region. The Ukrainians are saying that around the Kursk and around Ukraine positions in the Sumy direction, there is 60,000 army, 60,000 strong Russian group, and Ukrainians are saying if they take a decision, if they decide to fall back from Sumy, then this 60,000 strong Russian group will launch a large-scale offensive operation against Ukraine from there in the direction of Sumy. And this is the reason why the Ukrainians still keep their forces on the territory of the Kursk region. The Ukrainians are saying that currently the main purpose of the battle with the Russians is not to hold their positions in the Sumy direction. The most important is to exhaust the Russian forces. So the task of the armed forces of Ukraine is the following: to exhaust the Russians as much as possible, to turn the 60,000 strong army into, let's say, 5,000 strong army, let's say by dealing significant damage and suffering significant losses for the Russians. We understand that on the other side, the Ukrainians will suffer the same losses. But as for this, the Ukrainians are ready for this. It's okay for them if they would be exhausted as well. Anyway, if the Russians are exhausted, they will not be able to continue moving further. This is the main logic of the armed forces of Ukraine and Ukrainian military authorities. Now let's discuss the situation in the north and Sudzha direction. According to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions to the west of the settlement of Malaya Loknya. Several tree lines were captured by the Russians. The Russians started their offensive or counter-offensive operation 4 days ago, and during the previous 4 days there were very heavy clashes in the fields and for the tree lines and the fortifications to the west of Malaya Loknya. And by the end of the 11th of January, the Russians still haven't answered Malaya Loknya itself. There are very heavy clashes. The Ukrainians are sending more and more forces, as we discussed. The most important for the Ukrainians, despite the fact that the Ukrainian most likely both the Ukrainians and the Russians are going to be exhausted, to stop the Russians here, to stop them on the Kursk direction and not to allow the Russians to attack in the direction of Sumy. As for the northern Kursk direction, during the previous 24 hours, different pro-Russian sources reported that as a result of offensive operation, the Russians managed to establish complete control over the settlement of Kostiantynivka, and the Russians managed to secure completely the village of Berdin. The village of Berdin is the territory where the Ukrainians launched their own offensive operation, and now the Russians are saying that just by the end of the 11th of January they managed to secure the village completely and the tree line to the south of the settlement. The Russians currently are bombing the settlement of Cherkasskaya Porechna, and most likely during the next several days they will make first attempts to test Ukrainian defense on the territory of this settlement as well. So the most important part of the Sudzha offensive or the Battle of Sudzha is going to start. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the north in Kupiansk direction. According to information we have, according to different mappers, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to improve their positions on the northern bank of the river of Nizhnya Dvorechna in the northern part of the settlement of Sudzha. As for the central Kupiansk direction, during the previous 24 hours we haven't received anything special. The Russian sources published several videos of how they were attacking and bombing the positions of the armored forces of Ukraine on the territory of the settlement of Zeleny Gai. Maybe the Russians are preparing the village before offensive operation. Now let's move further. As for the Liman direction, according to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions to the west of the settlement of Novosadova and to take under control a few Ukrainian strongholds and tree lines. This information was provided us by neutral mappers. As for the Sivers direction, during the previous 24 hours we haven't received anything special. We got just one video of how the Russians were bombing the Ukrainian positions on the territory of Perezhny in the southern part of the settlement. Based on this video we have adjusted the map in Ukrainian favor. These territories were colored by different mappers probably several months ago in the Russian favor based on nothing, so that was just like updates from different neutral mappers and pro-Russians, and by the 11th of January we haven't received anything from this direction, and just today we got first geolocation of how the Russians were bombing the Ukrainian positions. Most likely either the Russians didn't answer the village of Perezhny at all, or the Ukrainians counterattacked and managed to restore control over some territories. Now we are coming to the city of Chasiv Yar, probably as for the end of the 11th of January, the most important and the most interesting direction. According to information we have, during the previous several days, as a result of offensive operation, the Russians managed to encircle the Ukrainians on the territory of the forest and the micro-district of Novo of the city of Chasiv Yar. There are several thousands of Ukrainians were blocked in this area. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians managed to encircle additional group of the armored forces of Ukraine on the territory of the Chasiv Yar citadel. And later the Russians made ultimatum, but the Ukrainians refused, and now the Ukrainians are trying to counterattack the Russians by sending more and more forces. The Ukrainians are not counting losses because they understand if they lose, the Russians may capture up to 2,000 or 3,000 of Ukrainian soldiers that are currently located on the territory of the citadel and on the territory of the forest. The Russians control the situation, and during the previous 24 hours we got another batch of the videos of how the Ukrainians were taking positions in the northern and the northwestern part of the city of Chasiv Yar, and how the Russians, with the use of different types of drones, were destroying Ukrainian positions. In this video we can see another fiber optic drone video, how the Russians discovered the temporary deployment point of the armored forces of Ukraine, and as a result of FPV drone attack, this temporary deployment point was destroyed. In the southern direction we can see the same pictures. As for now, the Russians are trying to secure the territory of Novi micro district. On the most southern positions there are something like temporary deployment points, something like checkpoints that Ukrainians use for rotation purposes between the forest and the micro district itself. The Russians established complete FPV drone control, and if we increase the numbers of days since the beginning of January, we're gonna receive a lots of videos exactly from this part. So this is the core of defense in this micro district. If the Russians are able to break the Ukrainian defense here, most likely the forest would collapse immediately. The same story in the northern part. We had lots of videos during the January, and most likely we are going to continue them in the future. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation about the southern Chasiv Yar direction. According to information we have, during the past 24 hours the Russians managed to improve their positions along Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal and to take several strongholds of the armored forces of Ukraine under Russian control. So we see that currently the length of the front line, the length of the foothold of the armored forces of Russian Federation from the north to the south is more than 10 kilometers, and 10 kilometers is enough to begin another full-scale offensive operation in the direction of the city of Kostiantynivka. I'm not sure, and I don't have this information, but something tells me, like the fifth feeling, that something big, something interesting, and something fast lightning is going to happen in the direction of Kostiantynivka. Something tells me that this entire direction, the defense of the armored forces of Ukraine, will collapse as soon as the Russians begin full-scale offensive. I don't think that Ukrainians are ready to meet the Russians and to repel upcoming Russian attacks. And something tells me that the disaster for the armored forces of Ukraine is going to start exactly on this direction, because the Russians are planning to attack the city of Kostiantynivka not from the east, from the elevation of the city of Chasiv Yar. The Russians are about to begin offensive operation, very powerful offensive from the city of Toretsk. And furthermore, the Russians are going to attack the city of Kostiantynivka not just from the east, from the city of Chasiv Yar, not just from the south, from the city of Toretsk. Most likely the Russians will make several attacks or several attempts to attack along N32 road with the purpose to cut supply lines. So once again, I believe that Kostiantynivka will fall much faster than any other city or town during the special military operation. As for the city of Toretsk, during the past 24 hours, different mappers confirmed that the Russians managed to leave the city of Toretsk further in the northern direction, and today we got the first video from the northern part of the city. In this video we can see how the Russian soldier was taking off the Ukrainian flag and how he was replacing the Ukrainian flag with the Russian one. This video took place exactly in this area. We haven't adjusted anything, we just confirmed that the Russians control more than 95% of the city of Toretsk. The Ukrainians most likely still have their positions on the territory of the mine of Toretskaya, but if the situation continues developing the same way, the Ukrainians most likely would be forced to fall back and abandon their positions in the northern direction towards the village of Pishevka. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Pokrovsk direction. Currently there are very heavy clashes for the railways and for the road TO406. The Russians currently are attacking the Ukrainian positions using three roads of attack. The first one goes in the western direction from Novotroitska, Novosilka in the direction of Novoalexandriivka. This is very important offensive, and if the Russians are able to take these territories under complete control, then the Russians will be able to turn in the western direction and to begin their offensive operation to the north in the direction of Udachne. But to do this, first they need to secure the village of Uspenovka. This is the reason why the Ukrainians are sending more and more forces and reinforcements in the area of the village, because they understand if they lose the village, most likely the Ukrainians will lose the village of Udachne. And if the village of Udachne falls, this is going to be another disaster story for the armored forces of Ukraine. While the Russians are moving in the western direction, another group of forces of the armed forces of Russian Federation is moving from the settlement of Salona in the direction of Udachna itself. And during the previous 24 hours, pro-Ukrainian sources have adjusted their maps in Russian favor. And when talking about this direction, we see that the dynamic in this area is pretty fast. For example, this is the situation on the 8th of January. On the Orthodox Christmas, the Russians just announced control over the settlement of Salona without any proofs. And on the 9th of January, the Russians managed to improve their positions and to take several tree lines between Vovka and Salona under complete control. By the 10th of January, the Russians and the Ukrainian sources provided geolocations that confirm Russian control over the settlement. And by the 11th of January, the Russians managed to take under control this territory, and this is already at 2.5 kilometers behind the city, the town of Udachna. Furthermore, the Russians are moving from Vovkove and Pishchane in the direction of Kotlina. There are very heavy clashes in this area. During the previous 24 hours, we got another batch of videos of how the Russians were hunting and destroying Ukrainian tanks and vehicles that were moving along the road. In this video, we can see another tank of the Western production that was destroyed as a result of Russian FPV drone attack. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Andreevka fortified area direction. According to information we have, the Russians managed to break through the Ukrainian defense belt, and now the Russians through the fields are moving in the southwestern direction with the purpose to shorten the distance between the Russian positions and the positions of the armed forces of Ukraine on the territory of Andreevka fortified area. During the previous 24 hours, lots of mappers adjusted their maps in Russian favor. We are talking about pro-Russian resources, about neutral resources, about different pro-Ukrainian resources. So as you can see, very interesting situation, and if the Russians are able to reach the Balka, another Balka Orekhova, then the Russians will be able to establish complete fire and FPV drone control over the settlement of Andreevka. As for the Kurakhove direction, during the previous 24 hours, we got lots of videos of how the Russians were trying to destroy Ukrainian vehicles that were located and that were deployed by the Ukrainians as close as possible to the settlement of Velyka, most likely waiting for evacuation. The Russians destroyed the bridges and established complete control over the mine supply roads. So it's just Ukrainians can do is to wait a good time, to wait proper time for evacuation. But when the day comes, the Russians began flying above area and hunting the abandoned and half-destroyed Ukrainian vehicles with the purpose not to allow the Ukrainians to evacuate them. As for the city of Kurakhove, today the Russian sources published the video with the significant number of Ukrainians that surrendered on the territory of the settlement. Several days ago, the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of clashes, 16 soldiers of 46 Air Mobile Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine surrendered on the territory of the city of Kurakhove. And later, the Ukrainian sources start saying that that information was just a fake. And today, on the 11th of January, the Russians published a real video with real Ukrainians of 46th Brigade that confirmed that they were abandoned by their commanders and that they decided to surrender because they didn't have any other option. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Velyka Novosilka direction. As you can see, during the previous 24 hours, we got a lot of very interesting geolocations and articles and map changes. According to different pro-Russian resources, by the end of the 11th of January of 2025, the Russians managed to establish complete control over the settlement of Niskuchna. We're talking about this one. We are waiting for additional changes on the ground from some reliable map services or maybe some geolocations. As for now, we're not going to change the map. We most likely the village of Niskuchna was captured by the Russians, let's say for 30% or something like this. Obviously, there are still very heavy clashes, but anyway, it's just a matter of several days. It's not the question whether the Russians are able to take the village of Niskuchno or not. It's just the question whether it's going to happen this upcoming night or during the next upcoming night. Furthermore, during the previous 24 hours, we got a lot of videos from the southern part. In this video, we can see how the Russians began very heavy artillery preparation of the farms that are located on the southern part of the settlement of Velyka Novosilka. Another video we got from the northern part, the same story. The Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions with the use of the multiple launch rocket systems, and this is another proof that the Russians may try to attack the village of Velyka Novosilka from the northeast. So let's wait and see if all these updates are correct and is right. Then the Russians began their offensive and final offensive. Obviously, it will take 2, 3, 4, 5 days before the end of the battle, but most likely during the 20th of January or before, during the Trump's inauguration, the village of Velyka Novosilka would be captured by the Russians completely, and we are going to see several flags on the territory of the settlement. The same story we are going to see in the city of Toretsk also during the next 10 days. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.